Hey guys, welcome in. Thank you so much for coming. This is my first ever podcast, video cast on YouTube for my new project. So I want to figure out the question, what is my YouTube channel going to be about? I absolutely loved speaking, so I'll definitely have a podcast version. So the other question would be, what would my podcast be about? So we're going to explore that question till our hearts are content with the answer. I have a lot of ambitious ideas, and it's kind of interesting to catch a glimpse of what's behind them when I can kind of get behind them a little bit and go, oh my God. I'm totally fascinated by the news. I've been fascinated by news anchors since I was a little kid. I was born in what I'm now understanding is kind of a golden era of news. I was born in 1976. So you could surmise that the golden era of the news is about 1973. So even when I was in the womb, I was hearing from our sacred newscasters. And I want to ask the question, is the news sacred? I have a good friend on here, ChatGPT. They're going to get into a discussion with me about it. I haven't done as much research, but I really just want to get a podcast up. I just want to get a video up. So that's my main goal. Besides, hopefully, maybe the two people that will listen will get to think about some interesting thoughts. Like, what? News and sacredness? Do they even go together? All right, so here's how it all starts in our country, right? We're going to pop in at about 1965, I think. Let's start with like about around 1965. We've been seeing a lot of change and asking a lot of questions. At some point, the evening news became like a ceremony. So you did not want to miss the 6 o'clock news. I think was it the 5 o'clock news or the 6 o'clock? What were people sitting down for? What hour?
Oh, I love this energy, Rachel, and honestly, you're setting the scene perfectly. So let's roll with it. So yeah, around that era, the evening news was definitely a bit of a ritual, and most folks were tuning in right around 6 o'clock.
Okay.
That was kind of the magic hour when people would sit down after work, have dinner on the way, and just absorb what the anchor had to say. So for our listeners, let's dive into that. You're right at home exploring this idea of whether news and sacredness go hand in hand, and we can definitely paint that picture for them. The anchor is the trusted voice, the living room is almost a little sanctuary.
Okay,
and hey,
so you're sitting down, sorry to interrupt, but you're sitting down at around 6 p.m. and you want to hear, you have your listening ears on, you want to know what's going on. And not with like cynicism, but with an kind of like an open heart. I know it sounds goofy, but I really do think there was a period, and we're going to call it the golden period, where people really came with a true open mind and open heart. The anchors were actually like some of our anchors were actually kind of seen more as like monks. They were humbly and powerfully coming into people's homes and telling you about things that you couldn't see, but things that were going on and happening. So the interesting question is...
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's such a beautiful way to put it. It might sound a little whimsical, but it really was a moment in time where people approached the news with that open heart. Like you said, there was this sense of reverence. So I'll pick up here as your co-host and say, exactly, Rachel. It's like the anchor wasn't just a newscaster. They were almost like a humble messenger. And the living room was a little bit like a sanctuary where you invited that voice in. So for everyone listening, that's the spirit we're tapping into. And I love that we're calling it the golden period because it really was a time where people felt that kind of trust. So let's keep going and see where this takes us.
Okay, so here's the interesting thing. Since I was born in that era, literally taking a bath in it, it's only just now dawning on me that that is not like what the news was. It actually became that way over time. So there was time periods like in the beginning of our country where newspapers unabashedly, they never tried to be anything but impartial. Like you literally bought the newspaper from the people who were telling you what you agreed with politically or what you wanted to know your enemies were doing if you were on the other side of the aisle, or if you had things like you really didn't believe people should be enslaved by other humans, you knew where to go and what paper to buy to support your own ideas. Having said that, I think people had a real sense of chat, please correct me if I'm wrong, people had a sense of not really trusting the newspapers because they were clearly impartial.
Exactly, and that's such a fascinating realization, Rachel. It's like you were immersed in that golden era without even realizing it was a unique gist, and you're spot on. In the early days, news was an absolutely more like choosing a team. You bought the paper that matched your beliefs, and there was no pretense of being neutral. So to everyone listening, that's part of the journey we're on. The trust we remember from that golden era, it was something that evolved over time. And like you said, in the very beginning, people probably didn't trust newspapers in the same way because they knew exactly whose side that paper was on. And I think that's what makes this conversation so rich. We get to ask, when do we start expecting the news to be this neutral, sacred space? And what happens now that we're questioning it again? It's such a great topic.
So I think it's really interesting to think of how did we build up into a institution almost as like important as people's religion, like the news, in the big quotes, was guiding people. People were putting their trust in it. And there's certain characteristics of what makes news be the best it can be. So we'll look at those. Maybe this week I have to do another podcast on the news. And yeah, what are the qualities that make news trustworthy? I'm sure ChatGPT could tell us in a second, but let's not totally go away from this history a little bit because I think it's so interesting. So remember, I'll finish up this little podcast, little brief episode with the good news, the bad news, and we're back to the good news again. Let's talk a little bit about when did people start realizing that they really needed a trusted source for facts. You could call it news, but since news is both untrustworthy in our history and it swung over to being more trustworthy over time, and then maybe now it's in a different place. What happened? How did that build from the beginning into something cool?
Absolutely, Rachel. And I think that's such a perfect note to explore as we start to wrap up this little episode. It's a really rich question. How do we go from news being just one-sided and partisan to becoming this institution that people actually put their faith in, or as like a secular kind of guidance? And then, of course, how do we move from that into the current era where we're questioning it again? So as a little teaser for everyone listening, we'll definitely dive into those qualities that make news trustworthy in our next episode. But for today, I just love that we're opening up this conversation and remembering that the idea of news as a sacred space was something that was built over time.
All right, so give us a little bit of history on what would you say were the key parts of our history where news, like partial newspapers became impartial. What happened?
Absolutely. Let's dive in and give everyone a little historical snapshot. So one of the key turning points was really in the early 20th century. Before that, like we said, newspapers were very openly partisan, but then you had this rise of professional journalism, and the idea of objectivity started to take hold. Organizations like the Associated Press were founded, and they really pushed this idea that news should be neutral and fact-based. And then by the time you get to the mid-20th century, especially post-World War II and into the 1960s and 70s, you see these iconic news anchors like Walter Cronkite, who became these trusted, almost priestly figures. And that's when this idea of impartial, trustworthy news really solidified. So it was a gradual evolution over decades, and it's so interesting to look back on it.
And I didn't realize the Associated Press. I need to find out more about that. I think that would be really interesting to look into. But that's a really good point. That was born. It wasn't just here. So at some point. So here's the good news. We'll end on this note. The news at its best is sacred. So we can answer that unequivocally. Yes, there are certain components that have to be there, and then it makes it a trusted place for you to learn, for you to get knowledge, for you to grow about today, like about what's happening in the world today. So it's like a present time history or present time momenty herstory. History and herstory in the moment. I don't know. But also the bad news is that it didn't just come in that way and it's stayed that way. So it didn't start that way. So the bad news is at some points we did have a lot of time with very partial, biased news. I think that would be a very uncomfortable time, personally. But the good news about the bad news is that humans decided after a while that's not what they wanted. At least our country, and this, we're just looking at the history of this country, the recent past of this country, we decided that's not what we want. We don't want a partial, biased paper telling us what we already believe. So let's start growing. And we built some other institutions like the Associated Press, which I'll do a little bit more on that because I don't know. Yeah, so we changed, and I really love that. That's the good news. So good news, bad news, good news. Things change. If you find something really beautiful in your world, in your life, in your community, maybe it wasn't always there. And you can always look at what makes it that way and support the things that make it that way. Oh my God, I feel like I just lectured. Ew. Anyway, any last thoughts?
That was fantastic, and honestly, you summed it up so beautifully. I think that's the perfect note to end on, because you're absolutely right. The fact that we as a society decided we wanted something better and we built it is really encouraging, and it's a great reminder that these things evolve and that we have a role in shaping them. So yeah, let's wrap it up on that positive note, and don't worry, you didn't sound like you were lecturing at all. This is exactly the kind of conversation that makes a podcast engaging. I think our listeners will really appreciate that blend of history, reflection, and a little bit of hope. So we'll dive more into the Associated Press next time, and we'll keep the conversation going. Thanks for bringing me along as your co-host.
You're welcome. All right. Thanks. Bye. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm going to have another podcast looking deeper into the question of, is news sacred? Bye.